Hello you dirty potters, how are you today? Today we're going to talk about slip decorating on your pottery, a technique that's extremely easy and you can use on the high majority of your functional ware to give it a little bit of extra sauce. You see this cup right here? This was just an ordinary functional cup. It had none of this texture on it before I put slip on it. And for anyone who doesn't know what slip is, it's pretty much the sloshy result that you get when you mix a little bit too much water with your clay. You probably have been making slip your entire life and don't even know it. You know when you're just centering a piece of clay and you're taking a little bit too long to finish the piece? Well, that wet gooky stuff that comes off your hands is just slip. The only difference is I saved all of mine in a giant bucket because this bucket of slip actually has a lot of valuable uses in your studio. It serves as a reciprocal for all my pieces that might have failed. I can put a lot of my clay trimmings in here. I can put extra water in here, slip it around. I can technically make underglaze out of slip. I can also make decorations with it. I can score and slip with this bucket of slip. There's a bunch of things I can do with this. Plus, it makes a super satisfying wet sound whenever I slosh it around too much.
Hear that? Yeah. Macaroni in a pot.
Not only do I keep this bucket of slip around because I can use it for like 14 different things in my work, I can also just put this down on concrete or plaster, dry this out, and it turns into brand new recycled clay. I've already made an episode on recycling your clay. I will link it down below for you. It's pretty much just making slip out of old clay, drying it out, wedging it when it's completely dry, and there you go, you have brand new clay. Along with all of those things that I just named, it also makes an excellent decorational tool. You see all these mugs right here? These were ordinary mugs. There was no extra alterations I made to them or anything. I didn't do anything extra to these while I threw them. They were ordinary mugs. But afterwards, I added some slip to them, and now they have a little bit more flavor. Something to stand out among all the regular mugs that you might be seeing or making. The awesome part of this is that you don't have to do anything special while you're throwing, honestly. You can just make your mugs and your bowls and your cups and your plates as you usually would and add the slip on later. And this is what really gives it that flavor. And there's an infinite amount of patterns you can do to make this slip look different. It's kind of like adding your own handmade glaze, but it's just kind of a pattern that you want yourself. You can even make freeform patterns if you feel like it. And in today's episode, I'm going to show you 2 different ways to achieve this slip decoration. The first way that you've probably seen most Instagrammers and YouTubers do this technique, if you're familiar with this technique at all, is on the wheel, and that's the first way that we're gonna do it. All you have to do is throw a piece. And once you're done forming your piece on the wheel, all you gotta do is stick your hand inside the slip bucket and play with it a little bit. Just kind of take a nice big hand of slip and just lather it onto your piece as it spins. This is the way that I was first taught how to do it. All you do is throw your basic form, take a handful of slip from your slip bucket, lather it on there, and once it's lathered on there, you can either kind of move around the slip with your hands, making different patterns like this, or you can use a tool if you like. There's no shame in doing any, or you can take any tool to it and just play with it a little bit. This is pretty satisfying for me, and this is one of the ways that I really learned to make patterns with my slip like this. If this is your first time decorating with slip on the wheel, I heavily suggest doing it this way first, as opposed to the second technique, which I will show you fairly soon. This allows you to really get used to the consistency of your slip because you can change it based on how much water or clay you add. It also allows you to discover new patterns like this, use different tools, and kind of just play around with what you're doing. Keep going until you find a pattern that you like. And as you keep going, you'll sooner or later you'll kind of get the drift of this. Give it a little bit of swag. Just keep on giving it. Just keep on playing with the slip. You'll figure out what you like sooner or later. Yeah, you like that? Yeah, that's your favorite right there, isn't it? When I first learned this technique, my teacher only taught it to me on the wheel because he knew that this was the experience I needed to start playing around with making textures and slip on the wheel with my pottery. This was something that I needed to experience before I moved on to the second technique that I learned sooner or later.
お前はもう死んでる。あ、何？
Okay, I'm just gonna put this up here. Just gonna clean it up a little bit. Just, yeah, okay. Okay, yeah. And 1, 2, okay. Potter tip! By this time, you're probably wondering what the consistency of your slip should be. I personally like it to be kind of creamy, like thick peanut butter. Just enough to move around and still have some viscosity to it, but also not so thick that it will just stay on the spoon. I want it to kind of drip off a little bit, if you will. By this point, you're probably already wondering how thick your slip should be or what the appropriate thickness of your slip should be for it to be most effective. It's really up to you. I personally enjoy my slip at a creamy peanut butter texture, so this way it still stays on whatever I put it on, but with a little bit of force, it comes right off of whatever I want it to have. This way, gravity still affects it, but not as much as if it was super liquidy. If you find your slip being way too thin or way too watery, you can always just add little bits of clay to it, dried pieces that you have, dried trimming that you have, and just kind of mix it up after the clay has become oversaturated with water. Sooner or later, it'll just naturally become part of the slurry, making more slip and making it a little bit thicker. Don't add water, just add a little more clay. You can technically even scoop up the stuff at the bottom of your throwing bucket and just add it to the slip bucket. It's most likely already saturated and turning into slip anyway. Just add that stuff in, mix it up, and you'll get thicker slip in no time. Or if you're having the opposite problem and you want your slip to be a little bit more watery, not as thick, you can just do the opposite. Add a tiny bit of water to it and mix it in again. This will very easily, with a little bit of water, mind you, it doesn't take much, make it a little bit more watery. It's extremely easy to control the viscosity of your slip and how thick it is. Once you have your own bucket of slip, you'll start to get a feel for what you like as far as the thickness of your slip. But it's extremely easy to make it thicker or thinner based on how much clay or water that you add. And when I first started playing with slip on the wheel in this way, I was super excited because now I have a way to make all my super functional, basic Walmart looking shapes interesting and play with slip and actually figure out what I like in my own artwork, a way to express myself. But sooner or later, I stopped putting slip on the wheel for a couple of reasons. Number one, let's say I'm making something super delicate or something that's already kind of fighting gravity by itself. Maybe the rim of a plate, maybe the rim of a bowl that I've been working on a little too long. I would then technically be adding more weight to that area by way of trying to make slip with this style of slip decoration. I'm just kind of globbing on super heavy slip to this, and as I work on it, sooner or later it's gonna start to flop. And now I just kind of have a wobbly piece. Not only was this just the start of me putting this slip on here, the longer it stays on here, the more gravity is going to affect it and the more saturated my clay body is going to get. This usually happens whenever you're working on something super thin and fine, or it happens whenever you've just tired out your clay from working on it too long and it becomes oversaturated with water anyway. And whenever I was making stuff that was super fine, I couldn't really decorate it with slip because it would just fall over. Sometimes I would even leave it, let it dry, and just kind of add extra fans and tools to it so I can come back in the morning and see it dry. Nope, it still flopped down like this and kind of made everything super wonky. Usually whenever I have a plate with a super thin, fine rim, this happens, so I don't prefer to do it on the wheel anymore. The second problem that I would have with this technique doing this technique this way is that if I decided that I liked a specific pattern on the clay body that I just added slip to, let's say this. Let's say I really like this pattern and I threw it and I put the slip on the wheel and now I want to keep this pattern. Now, not only do I have to be super delicate with taking this off of the wheel, I cannot touch the inside or wherever I put the slip, which is usually on the outside to be fair, of this vessel at all. This is now set in stone. It's going to be very difficult to trim this. It's going to be very difficult to take it off of the wheel. It's just going to be difficult all around. If I want to keep this exact pattern, I now have to be extremely careful with how I touch this. And this makes it all the more difficult to take it off of the wheel, trim it, handle it afterwards. It's just a nightmare. So I stopped doing this technique on the wheel. The second technique is pretty much just the first technique, but instead of adding your stuff on the wheel, you add it in the leather to leather soft phases of your ceramic artwork. Take this for example. I just trimmed and attached this handle maybe an hour ago, so I can still kind of make little marks in my pottery like this. This is technically still in the leather phase. In this phase, I don't really have to worry about mishandling my artwork or it flopping down or anything of that manner. I can simply add slip to this and not have to worry about it. Not only that, I can do it in whatever pattern I want because I can take my time as this slowly dries. This is the second technique. It's pretty much just finishing your pottery first and then adding it right after you trim your product, as long as it's nice and handleable. The only catch to this style of the technique is that you probably should trim a foot and you should probably have your foot be a little bit more pronounced than usual. This way you have something to grab onto when you dip your pot into the slip and start playing with it. You can also dip it into the slip, put it down and start messing with it that way. That's up to you. I just prefer to do it this way. All you have to do is take your freshly trimmed pot, dump it right into the slip as much as you want. And when you pull it out, you can just do any decoration that you feel like. I personally like to get a metal rib and just make straight lines going downwards. And now I have work that actually looks interesting instead of being the same shape all the time. And this actually looks really good with certain glazes on it. You'd be surprised the texture that this kind of adds to a lot of glazes that you would put on slip work. Granted, you do have to be a little bit careful with it whenever you're putting it down, but it's far easier to handle in this stage than it would be on your wheel, because you can pretty much just put your hand on the inside of this, put it on the foot, tip it upside down, and there you go, a completely undisturbed pot. If you're really having a difficult time with this technique and you can't just get the finger strength to put this directly in here, take it out, start playing with the slip and then put it down, you can always just get a brush and start doing this on your pottery on the side. There's absolutely no shame in just getting a wet peanut butter spoonful of this stuff and just putting it directly on your pottery and starting to play with it. Look, I'm sorry this episode is so long and there's so many potter's tips and so many potter's cheat codes, but it turns out some of you actually listen to me sometimes and you benefit from this, so this is a potter's cheat code, something that I'm pretty sure your teacher would not like if I told you, but I'm gonna tell you because it probably is gonna help out a lot of beginner and intermediate potters. You see this mug right here? I let it dry a little bit too fast last night. I don't know if you can see it, but there's technically a very, very small crack right there. Sometimes after firing, these cracks are visible. Sometimes you can shove a little bit more clay in there, a little more slip in there. Sometimes the glaze covers it up, but usually it's a good bet that you should just patch that up, or you should have done it right and slow dried it the first time. All of that being said, you can very easily cover that with the texture that is this technique. Oh, what, you had cracks in your pottery? You can't even see it now. Oh no, I had all these cracks in my pottery, but I can't even see them now. Looks like the teacher's just gonna have to give me an A. Keep in mind that while adding slip to your clay body can give it some really nice textures and some personality, there is a point of no return. This bottle right here is a bisque product of something that I added slip onto last week. It's pretty ready to go, but I added this on in the leather to leather soft phases of the trimming. Pretty much right after I trimmed this, I just added slip right on like I showed you earlier. But if you ever let your pottery get to the bone dry phases of ceramic artwork, you might end up with something like this. It's the same exact clay body and it's the same exact slip. The only difference is that I put it on in the bone dry phases instead of the leather phases of trimming. This will sometimes create a contradiction in between the super wet slip that you put on and the inside of the pot, which is super bone dry. You pretty much just added super watery slip into a super dry clay body, which caused cracks to happen on the outside. Keep in mind that the pottery itself isn't cracked, just the slip on the outside, and some people might even think this effect is cool, purposely making cracks in your pottery like this by way of slip. But if you decide to put bone dry clay with slip on it, sometimes this will happen as a contradiction of wet and dry is happening on your pot. As a little side note, be aware that you are adding wet slip to a drying clay body, which means that it's gonna take a little bit longer to dry out than usual. So I heavily suggest after putting this stuff on your pottery that you just kind of leave it out. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I just wanted to show you this technique, even though it was kind of a long episode. I feel like every point that I hit was important for the process. It's kind of as simple as just getting wet clay, turning it into a slurry, and adding it to your pots, but at least all the things we addressed are the things that you need to look out for when doing this. It's that simple, but at the same time, the little things really matter. Plus, I just kind of wanted to demysticize all the potters online who are like, check out this crazy thing, when realistically, we just added wet clay to the outside of a pot and then called it interesting. Like now you know how to do this yourself, so now you can make that kind of stuff yourself. The real difficult part of this is just getting a giant bucket of slip so that you can always have slip on hand like this. This isn't something that most people have in their classes. Well, that about wraps it up for me. If you'd like to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below for your beautiful potter eyes to see. I have my own web store where you can buy some of my artwork. The podcast link is down there. The Instagram, the Facebook, all the linkety links that you're smart. You know where to find them. That being said, good luck on the wheel, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week.
Thank you for your patronage.
That simple, but at the same time, the little things really matter, much like your ex-boyfriend.